Hi all, welcome to today's academic webinar, Understanding Complex Readings. I'm Betsy Malarczyk. I am a learning skills specialist with the Academic Resource Center. And today we are going to talk about how to take those readings that just make you zone out and stop paying attention, and how to discern meaning from sometimes dense, complicated textual passages. I wanted to start with a quick poll. Which of your classes do you find has the most difficult readings? So I'm launching the poll now. There may not be an exact match for your classes here, but if you have something that isn't included, please feel free to add it in the chat. So I find it really interesting that so far the answers are all over the place. We have a theology, some philosophy, some science. We have politics and current events. We have a few in the chat: law, theory within my field, anything that doesn't flow logically or categorically, higher ed, which I relate to, because really when it comes to being a clear writer, that's not something that is specific to any particular field. You can be a terrible writer and still be prominent in your respective field. So I'll share the results with you so you can take a look, but they're really quite spread out, which I find to be really interesting based on the folks who are here. So we're going to start by, I really appreciate the note that we have, sometimes texts don't flow logically. We're going to start with some examples that do flow more logically, but we're going to move into more difficult readings and more difficult readings. Sort of the theme for this talk is starting large and getting smaller and smaller and focusing your energy on a micro level. So an important note that I want to make before we go into this is that every text is different. There is no one template for understanding everything. That's why before breaking down a reading, you need to understand how the piece is structured. So having that analytical eye and looking at how it's put together is a first important step before you can even begin to comprehend the meaning. That leads us into the concept of previewing a text. This also goes by the name of pre-reading. There are some other names you may have seen this term by as well. But what this means is to physically look at how a piece is structured in order to guess how it's put together. So the first step for this is to visually scan the text to see how many distinct sections it contains. If this is a physical book, you're going to be looking for titles, headings, chapter length, paragraph length. If this is a chapter on an ebook or an online article, you still want to scan to see how it's broken up and how long it is. I was looking with someone recently at an online textbook where there was a drop-down menu and each menu led to a different section. You want to still ask yourself, how long is each section and how many sections are there? You don't even have to read at this point. You're just looking at how it's visually put together. The second step is to look at titles and headings to determine the main argument of each section. So you want to try to guess what the main topic, main idea, or main argument is before you even read. So I'll go into an example of what this can look like in a moment. And then you can't always pick out what the main argument is. So if that's the case, try to guess the function of each section. Is this an introduction? Is this an example? What is the purpose? But before you can break down those passages, it will help you to understand the purpose of what that passage is doing. So our first example here is from a book for pre-med students. So we're breaking down here the concept of pneumonia. Without reading this text, I can physically scan this to see that it's broken into 3 major sections, each with their own heading. And then I can also see that there are 3 subheadings within that. So just brought up some arrows to point those out. We see that there's this main section titled pneumonia. Under that, classification of pneumonia, then clinical findings of pneumonia. And then we also have these subheadings, typical or atypical, and so on. So without having read this piece, but understanding how textbooks are generally put together, I have a sense of what the function of each of these sections is without even reading it. So this first section, titled pneumonia, I'm guessing provides an overview of the concept. The section titled classification of pneumonia explains the different types. Those 3 subheadings, each one will provide an overview of the 3 different types, and then clinical findings will go over how pneumonia is identified. So with a textbook, it is often much easier because there is all this structure presented. That's because textbooks are often giving you factual information and they need to break it down so you can use it as a reference material. That's not always the case. One of the reasons that we really are thinking about what each section is saying or what its purpose is that this allows us to think about the big picture. By understanding the argument of the text or the main idea of the text, that will then help us understand how small details relate to the big picture. If you have one puzzle piece and you don't know what you're making a puzzle of, then that piece has less meaning. However, if you have a puzzle of Georgetown's main campus, and then you have a gray puzzle piece that looks like some stone, you know this might be Healy Hall. So getting that big picture helps those small details have more meaning. So how do you identify the big picture? If you're sitting down with a reading, it looks dense and you don't even know how to start. Often the first paragraph or the introduction of the book might give you a clue. The introduction, the whole purpose is to ease you into the topic. Alternately, you can also jump to the end and read the conclusion paragraph before you even jump into the reading, or look at the end to see if there's any clear bullet points or summary. Again, the conclusion is going to help summarize the main argument. So if you know where the piece is going, then you know how the little pieces fit in with that main concept. If your reading doesn't make sense, doesn't have these clear traditional writing pieces, you might check your syllabus to see if your professor has posted the topic for your next class session. Or if you have multiple readings, you might also just look at the titles for those readings. Because even if that doesn't tell you the main idea of the reading specifically, it will tell you the main idea of what your professor wants you to get out of it, which will help you focus while reading the text. And if your professor doesn't provide those details, you could also think about the last topics that you discussed in class. How does this topic that you have in front of you relate to your last conversation? Typically, classes are building on one another. One idea is leading into the next. So most classes aren't going to jump randomly from one idea to another without a clear connection, even if it isn't always clear to you. So the first example we looked at was this beautiful textbook. Not always what we have to read, but what should you do if a reading isn't divided into clear sections? I have here a section from St. Augustine's The Confessions, which is a popular reading at Georgetown. And we've got much bigger, uglier paragraphs. We don't have lovely headings. We don't have bolded, kind of goalposts telling us what the meaning of each thing is. So in order to take this big text, we have to look for the natural organic breaks in the text and treat those as their own section. Usually when there is an organic break, it's because there is a new idea that is being completed and a new idea is being begun. So any break that occurs in the text, even if it isn't clearly demarcated or you're not provided with a signpost, is still separated for a reason. So with this particular selection where we have sections 1, 2, 3, 4, we don't know what the main idea of each section is, but we are going to treat section 1 as its own unit, section 2 as its own unit, section 3 as its own unit. And what that means, treating it as its own unit, is that we are going to look for the main idea within that section. What is it that section 1 has to say as its one main argument it's communicating? What is it that section 2 has to say as its main idea that it's communicating? But even this feels easier than some texts sometimes look. Let's continue a few pages further into the same book from St. Augustine, where we have the 6th section, which just goes on, starts at the bottom of this first page, big paragraph, big paragraph, big paragraph, really long, aggressive paragraphs. But again, as I said before, when there are organic breaks from one idea to another, it's because the main idea is changing or moving forward. So even though it's something we don't see as a clear section, for this text, we would treat each paragraph as its own unit. So we've got these big, massive paragraphs. What we're going to do is approach each paragraph as its own section, just as the textbook had a section titled Clinical Findings, and that was the purpose. We're going to consider each of these paragraphs its own section and basically try to figure out what that heading would be. What is that major idea that this one massive paragraph is trying to communicate? So when you have dense paragraphs like this, how can you begin to decode them? One thing that is helpful to keep in mind is that paragraph structure often mimics essay structure. This isn't always the case, but when you're previewing a text, it's helpful to take a look at your paragraphs and see which of these components that you see in an essay your paragraph has. So an essay typically begins with an introduction, then it will move into evidence. That evidence will be followed by analysis, and it will end with a conclusion. Paragraphs often do the same thing. They start with an introduction of the main idea, then they might have some kind of evidence of that idea, they might analyze that idea, and then end with a conclusion summing up that main idea. So that leads us to the key tools in decoding paragraphs, the anatomy of a paragraph. The topic sentence is considered the thesis of a paragraph. Often, this is the first sentence of a paragraph. And often just by reading the first sentence, you can get a sense of what the main point is that paragraph is trying to make. However, this is not always the case. Luckily, we can often look at the conclusion sentence as well. This is the last sentence of a paragraph, which is often a summary of the paragraph's main idea. I think it's important to note that topic sentence and conclusion sentence can often be more than one sentence. You might be looking at one or two, but identifying if there's a topic sentence, if there's a conclusion sentence, and if so, how many, is something to think about when you're previewing the text. When you're looking at a paragraph for the first time, where do you find the main idea sticking out? And with that particular reading, wherever the main idea is in one paragraph is a good place to look for the main idea in the next paragraph. So if one paragraph doesn't have any topic sentence, but it has a very strong concluding sentence, then start the next paragraph by reading that last sentence to try to pick out the main idea. If you're still unsure how to identify the main idea of a paragraph, consider looking at the first and last sentence of the paragraph and considering how they relate to one another. Essentially, the goal of the paragraph is to get from point 1 to point 2. So if you can figure out that connection on your own by looking at those two grounded texts, it will help you fill in the rest of the details in the middle. So here we have another great paragraph from Augustine, one of these classic long guys. We're not going to read through the whole thing. When I'm sitting down to read this, I'm overwhelmed immediately, and I don't know how to break this down. So I'm going to start by focusing on that topic sentence and that concluding sentence. So for this particular paragraph, I am focusing on the very first sentence. So that's the topic. And then I'm also looking at the last two sentences. I've noticed that my last sentence is kind of short and doesn't seem to have a main idea in it. It seems to build on the sentence before it. So I'm grabbing those last two sentences. And now I'm going to analyze these sentences. So our topic sentence reads, "For after it became quite clear to me that he was inexperienced in those arts in which I had thought he excelled, I began to despair that he could open up and solve the problems that were troubling me." My concluding sentences read, "For more beautiful is the temperance of an honest soul than the things I wanted to know. And in all the more difficult and more subtle questions, I found him such." That is still a lot to me. It still does not make sense. I'm sure it doesn't make sense to you since we just picked a paragraph out of context from a reading you haven't read the rest of. So how do we break that down? What we're going to try to do is pick out the main idea of each sentence and rephrase it in our own words. So for the topic sentence, I'm focusing on the end of the sentence. Just by looking again at structure, what I know about sentence structure, I can see that that whole first part that I didn't bold starts with "for," and then there's a comma. So the main subject is I, and the main verb is began. So I'm just going to focus on the second half of the sentence. I began to despair that he could open up and solve the problems that were troubling me. So now I can understand this a little bit better. Augustine, who's the narrator, is despairing that this guy would help solve his problems. And then the concluding sentences, I already mentioned that I chose two sentences because the last one didn't seem to tell me much. So I'm not even going to focus on that. I'm going to look at that first sentence. "More beautiful is the temperance of an honest soul than the things I wanted to know." So this idea of things I wanted to know connects to that topic sentence, which said that I wanted this guy to solve my problems. So by connecting these two, I can put this main idea in my own words. Honesty is more beautiful than what I wanted to know. So now I have a main idea. This main idea isn't a substitute for what the text is telling me, but this is the main premise of what I'm supposed to get out of this paragraph. So this is basically an outline to guide me through that massive paragraph that I saw before. And I know that this is the point that I'm ultimately getting at. Knowing that this is the big idea can help me focus on what's important in the paragraph and what isn't important, because what I need to pay attention to is what relates to this main idea. So what do we do if a reading's sentences are just as complex as the paragraph as a whole? I just did a little bit of this, but basically we break the sentences down until we can figure out what's at the heart. So isolate key nouns and verbs by underlining them. So cross out unnecessary adjectives, unnecessary prepositional phrases, phrases that lead in as transitions, and just focus on what is the key subject and the key verb. And focus on that core idea at the center of the sentence. So here we have another great sentence from our medical textbook about the pneumonia-causing pathogen. And what I am going to do is start by breaking this long sentence into 3 distinct sections. Just by scanning this, I see that the word but is in here a couple times, which is a red flag for any reading. So I'm going to try to separate the 2 phrases beginning with but from the other sections. So here I've broken it into these 3 distinct areas, and I'm crossing out descriptive words and adjectives and prepositional phrases. And I'm going to take each idea on its own. So the first section, I'm getting rid of pneumonia causing and often. So we have the pathogen can be found in blood analysis. So that idea I can understand. The next section I've broken down to the patient remains asymptomatic. That I can understand. And then the third section is if the infection becomes established, significant signs and symptoms arise. So I don't understand all of these ideas when they're mushed together, but when they're broken down like this into separate ideas and I'm crossing out the unnecessary words, that really helps me focus. I definitely recommend underlining or highlighting the main core words to help you stay on task. It can also help keep you focused. The idea of underlining the main idea is just a key tip for if you space out when reading and need something to physically ground you into the text. Try underlining that topic sentence, or next to each paragraph, writing in the margins the main idea in your own words. And just kind of giving yourself that task can keep you engaged. So I mentioned this at the beginning of this session, but I wanted to reiterate it because it's super important. Every reading has its own unique structure. So you are beginning each reading by assessing how it's structured. I was talking about topic sentences. Not every reading has topic sentences, but every reading does have a main idea. So beginning by figuring out where you can find the main idea is going to help you read that piece more effectively and with more purpose. So here is your reading checklist. First step is to preview. Scan through the piece quickly to identify headings, chapters, and other demarcations. The fewer headings there are, the faster this process will be. This might be a 2-minute process. If there are a lot of headings, you might spend more time on this, but then that might also help the reading go more quickly. After you've previewed, assess the structure and look for patterns. So first decide how you break the larger reading into smaller units. Are you going to look at it subheading by subheading? Are you going to look at it paragraph by paragraph? And what I mean by that is determine which units you will be looking for the main idea of. If you have a piece with super short paragraphs, you don't need to necessarily spend time picking out the main idea of each paragraph. It might be more helpful for you to pick out the main idea of every page, but you need to figure that out based on how the reading looks and how it's broken up. And then once you've done that, analyze each smaller unit to identify where the main idea is emphasized. This might be a process that you do as you start reading. Maybe for the first paragraph, kind of highlight the structure, keep reading the second paragraph, see if there's another pattern. So you might read the first page cold, so to speak, but use that time to look for those patterns of where the main idea is. And then isolate main ideas. Pick out the primary argument of each smaller unit, and after you have selected the main argument, read through the rest of the section with that idea in mind. So again, the idea isn't that these main ideas are a substitute for reading the whole, but by doing this before reading that unit will be made more clear to you as a reader. So wanted to mention a few of our upcoming webinars. We have 2 in October. The next one's October 4th, developing a sleep schedule. So we'll talk about time blocking a little bit with that. And then October 19th, we're going to go over 5-day test prep. So how to come up with an effective study cycle. So thank you all for joining me today. If you have any questions, feel free to add them to the chat. Otherwise, thank you again and have a great afternoon. Happy reading.